I knew the HOA in my neighborhood was bad, but I didn't realize just how far they'd go until I nearly wrecked my car pulling into my own driveway. It was a Sunday morning, and my parents were coming over for lunch. They visited every couple of weeks, and my mother always brought way too much food. I had just pulled out some drinks when I heard a loud crunch outside. A moment later, my wife, Tessa, called out from the front door. "Nathan, you need to see this," she said, her voice sharp with concern. I hurried outside and stopped dead in my tracks. My driveway, the same one I had parked in just last night, was now covered in metal spikes small but sharp enough to shred any tire that rolled over them. My father's car was halfway up the drive, one of his tires already completely deflated. He opened the door, looking furious. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. I clenched my fists, my mind already racing through the possibilities. And then, as if summoned by the sheer audacity of the situation, there she was, Margaret Holloway, the HOA president. Margaret was a middle-aged woman with a permanent look of disapproval, as if she had smelled something awful and never quite recovered. She strolled up with a clipboard in hand, her lips pressed into a smug little line. Nathan," she said, feigning surprise. "I see you've discovered our new parking enforcement measure." "New parking enforcement?" I repeated, barely able to contain my rage. "You put spikes in my driveway." Margaret sighed dramatically. "It's not just you, Nathan. The HOA has decided to install anti-parking measures to prevent excessive guests from cluttering the neighborhood. Your family visits far too often, and we've received complaints." I took a slow, deep breath. "Complaints from who?" She gave a delicate little shrug. "Residents who value a peaceful community." I glanced around. A few of my neighbors had stepped outside, watching the scene unfold. Some looked concerned, others just curious. No one seemed particularly thrilled about the idea of spiked driveways. "This is illegal," I said, keeping my voice level. "You can't just install spikes without permission, especially on private property." Margaret's expression barely flickered. "Oh, but we can. Section 7, subsection D of the HOA agreement states that we have the right to implement safety measures to maintain order." I had read the HOA agreement when we moved in. There was no such clause. "You're overstepping, Margaret," I warned. "Remove the spikes before this gets worse for you." She laughed, actually laughed. "Nathan, you're a homeowner, not a lawyer. You don't have the authority to challenge HOA regulations." I folded my arms. "Actually, Margaret, I am the district attorney." The laughter died on her lips. For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret Holloway looked genuinely nervous. Margaret's confidence faltered as the realization set in. She had poked the wrong bear. Around us, the gathering neighbors whispered among themselves, their murmurs carrying a mixture of curiosity and unease. Some of them had likely dealt with the HOA's overreach before, but this was different. This was blatant, dangerous, and, most importantly, illegal. Margaret's fingers tightened around her clipboard. Her eyes darted to the spikes, then to my father's now disabled car. She seemed to weigh her options before forcing a saccharine smile. "I'm sure we can resolve this amicably," she said, her voice losing some of its earlier arrogance. I walked over to the spikes, crouching to get a better look. They weren't just haphazardly placed, they were bolted into the pavement. Someone had taken time to install these, which meant this wasn't some impulsive act. "You're going to remove these," I said evenly. "And then you're going to explain exactly who authorized this and how you thought it was legal." Margaret's lips parted as if to argue, but she caught herself. Instead, she flicked her gaze over her shoulder toward a man lingering near the curb. He was in his late 50s, with a stocky build and a permanent scowl. Alan Grayson, the HOA's so-called enforcement officer. He had a habit of lurking around the neighborhood, ticketing cars for being an inch over the line and measuring grass height with a ruler. Alan stepped forward, arms crossed. "Everything was done according to policy," he said. "You should have attended the last HOA meeting." I stood, my patience thinning. "No meeting gives you the right to tamper with private property or endanger lives. You've damaged my father's car. That's criminal property destruction." Margaret's face twitched. "Nathan, let's not escalate things unnecessarily. If your father submits a claim, we can discuss compensation." My father scoffed. "Discuss? You're paying for the damage, period." Tessa had been standing to the side, taking photos with her phone. Now she stepped up beside me, her tone calm but firm. "I've documented everything. The spikes, the damage, and the fact that you're trying to justify it. This is going to court if it's not fixed today. Margaret's mask of control cracked further, but she wasn't ready to back down. She turned to Alan, lowering her voice slightly. Call the contractor. Have them remove the spikes. Alan hesitated. That's going to cost us less than a lawsuit. I cut in. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she gave a sharp nod. Alan pulled out his phone, walking a few steps away to make the call. The neighbors who had been watching started murmuring among themselves. Some moved closer, emboldened now that Margaret was on the defensive. One of them, an older woman named Linda, shook her head. This has gone too far. First, they fine us for decorations. Now they're doing this. Another man, Jason, added, they've been getting away with too much. This needs to stop. I turned to the group. Anyone else have issues with them pulling stunts like this? A few hands went up. People started talking over each other, recounting fines for minor infractions, unauthorized charges on their HOA fees, and other abuses. It wasn't just me, this was a pattern. Margaret's face paled as she realized the tide was shifting. She wasn't just facing me anymore, she was facing the entire neighborhood. The contractor arrived within the hour. A wiry man with grease-stained fingers and a weary expression. He took one look at the spikes and muttered something under his breath. He and his crew got to work removing them, but I wasn't finished. I pulled out my phone and made a call to a colleague, someone who specialized in consumer and property rights. While I spoke, Margaret hovered nearby, pretending not to listen. When I hung up, she cleared her throat. Now that this is being resolved, we can. I cut her off. You're not getting out of this that easily, Margaret. You've committed criminal negligence, property damage, and likely violated multiple housing codes. We're filing a formal complaint with the city. Alan, who had rejoined her, shifted uncomfortably. This isn't necessary. We're fixing it. I stared him down. You're fixing it because you got caught. That doesn't erase the fact that you thought this was acceptable. Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but the arrival of a police cruiser silenced her. Tessa had called them while we were waiting. An officer stepped out, taking in the scene before approaching us. I greeted him, explaining the situation while showing him the photos and the damage. My father added his statement, detailing how his car had been damaged. The officer nodded along, his expression growing more serious by the minute. Margaret tried to interrupt, but the officer held up a hand. Ma'am, you and your HOA board may need legal representation. This is serious. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of red. She sputtered, but no words came out. I turned to the neighbors, raising my voice. If anyone else has complaints, now's the time. Speak up, document everything. This is how we stop them. One by one, people came forward. They had proof letters, emails, fines that made no sense. The officer took statements, his notepad filling quickly. Margaret, for the first time since I'd known her, had nothing to say. The officer's pen moved swiftly across his notepad as neighbors lined up to give their statements. Margaret stood stiffly by the curb, her expression locked in a grimace. Alan, for all his usual bravado, had gone quiet, his arms folded as he watched the situation spiral further out of control. The contractor's crew worked quickly, unbolting the spikes from my driveway. Each metallic clatter against the pavement was another nail in the HOA's coffin. I could see Margaret flinch slightly every time one was removed, as if each one represented a piece of her authority slipping away. The officer turned to me. We'll be filing a report on this. Between the damage to your father's vehicle and the unauthorized installation on private property, there are multiple legal violations here. The city's going to want to look into this further. Margaret finally found her voice. There's no need for that. We're handling it internally. The officer didn't even look up from his notes. That's not how this works, ma'am. You don't get to decide whether or not the law applies to you. She pressed her lips together, clearly realizing that arguing was only going to dig her deeper into trouble. I had seen plenty of people try to bluff their way out of bad situations in court, and Margaret had the same look they did when they realized their excuses weren't going to work. Tessa stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. What about the HOA funds? Where did the money come from to install these spikes? That question made Margaret glance toward Alan again, this time with something close to panic in her eyes. Alan shifted his weight, his gaze darting around as if looking for an escape route. I caught that immediately. You embezzled from the HOA budget to do this, didn't you? Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. Alan cleared his throat, but before he could speak, one of the neighbors, Linda, cut in. The HOA raised our fees last month, she said. They claimed it was for community improvements. Was this what that money was for? Murmurs spread through the crowd. Others chimed in, voices growing angrier as they pieced it together. Jason shook his head. You mean we paid for them to put down spikes that could have hurt any of us? Margaret's face turned red. That's not what happened. The officer raised an eyebrow. Then explain where the funds came from. Alan finally caved, his voice tight. We had a discretionary budget. The board approved the expense. Without informing the homeowners? I asked, because I don't remember getting any notice about this. Margaret tried to regain control. The board is allowed to make decisions in the best interest of the community. Jason scoffed. Best interest? You mean your interest? Linda wasn't done either. We need a forensic audit on the HOA's finances. Who knows what else they've been using our money for? Margaret's composure cracked completely. You don't have the authority to demand that. I met her gaze. Actually, we do. Homeowners have the right to request an audit, and if there's evidence of misappropriation, the city will get involved. That's going to happen now, whether you like it or not. The officer nodded. Sounds like there's reason to investigate. Margaret turned to Alan, her voice dropping to a hiss. Say something. Alan's jaw tightened. I think we should leave. Margaret's outrage was palpable. You can't just walk away from this. Alan's eyes flickered to me, then the officer, then the growing crowd of angry residents. I think we should leave, he repeated, firmer this time. Margaret looked at him as if he had betrayed her, but she saw what I did. There was no saving this. The HOA had pushed too far, and now they were facing consequences they never expected. The officer finished his notes. We'll be contacting the city attorneys. Nathan, I assume you'll be following up on this. I nodded. Oh, you can count on it. Margaret and Alan turned and walked off, their retreat marked by the quiet, simmering anger of the people they had spent years controlling. As they disappeared down the street, Linda turned to me. What do we do next? I smiled. We take back our neighborhood. The fight wasn't over, but the first battle had been won. And Margaret Holloway had just learned the hard way that some homeowners weren't so easily intimidated. The sun had shifted lower in the sky by the time the last of the spikes were removed from my driveway. The contractor's crew packed up their tools, throwing uneasy glances at the crowd of homeowners still lingering nearby. Margaret and Alan had slunk off, but their retreat hadn't done much to quell the rising anger of the neighborhood. If anything, it had only fueled it. Tessa finished forwarding the photos to the officer while my father examined the damage to his car. He crouched near the shredded tire, shaking his head before pushing himself back to his feet. He rubbed his chin in thought before turning toward me with a knowing look. They thought they could get away with this, he said, keeping his voice low. Makes you wonder what else they've been pulling behind the scenes. That was exactly what had been on my mind. The HOA board had been operating unchecked for far too long, and now that they had been caught doing something this blatant, there was no telling what else they had been hiding. Jason and Linda were still nearby, talking with a few other homeowners. Their conversation was growing more fervent, their frustration clear. I walked over, catching the tail end of Jason's words. They raised our fees and didn't even provide a breakdown of where the money was being spent. I asked for an itemized report last quarter, and they gave me the runaround. Linda nodded in agreement. Same here. They said financial records were confidential, but that's not how an HOA is supposed to work. I glanced around at the other residents. A few were already scrolling through emails on their phones, trying to pull up past communications from the HOA. Others were muttering among themselves, recounting suspicious charges or unexplained fines they'd received over the past year. Margaret's grip on the neighborhood had relied on intimidation and deception, but now that the dam had broken, people were starting to see just how deep the problems ran. I took a breath, choosing my next words carefully. We need to act fast. They're going to do everything they can to cover their tracks. Linda folded her arms. You think they'll try to destroy records? Without a doubt, I said. They didn't expect to be caught. Now that they're exposed, they're going to scramble. Jason ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. So what do we do? Tessa stepped up beside me. We need to demand an immediate review of the HOA's financial records. If they refuse, that alone is grounds to escalate this legally. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. I glanced toward my house, already forming a plan. I'll draft the formal request tonight. We'll need signatures from as many homeowners as possible to make it official. Once it's submitted, they're required to respond. Linda's eyes narrowed. And if they don't? Then we take it to the city and push for a full audit, I said. And if we find evidence of misappropriation? Fraud charges won't be off the table. Jason let out a low whistle. You think it's that bad? I met his gaze. They just installed metal spikes in my driveway using HOA funds without telling anyone. If they were willing to do that, imagine what else they've been doing with our money. That settled it. The neighborhood had been passive for too long, letting the HOA board run unchecked. But now, with a clear target and undeniable proof of wrongdoing, we had the leverage to fight back. By the time the gathering dispersed, most of the homeowners were on board. Tessa and I spent the next few hours drafting the formal request, ensuring every detail was airtight. Once it was ready, we printed out multiple copies and started going door to door. The response was overwhelming. Nearly everyone we spoke to was eager to sign. Some had their own grievances, ranging from unfair fines to suspiciously high dues. Others had been skeptical of the HOA for a while, but had never thought they could do anything about it. By the next morning, we had more than enough signatures. I sent the request via certified mail and followed up with an email to Margaret and the rest of the board. The waiting game began, but I had a feeling Margaret wasn't going to play fair. And I was right. 2 days later, a notice was posted on the community bulletin board, a hastily written announcement about a special emergency meeting of the HOA board. The language was vague, but the intent was clear. They were trying to regroup before they had to respond to our request. I wasn't about to let that happen. That evening, Tessa and I arrived at the HOA meeting early. The board had reserved the clubhouse, a modest space at the center of the neighborhood, and a few other homeowners had already gathered outside. Linda and Jason were among them, looking determined. They're stalling, Linda said as I approached, trying to figure out how to cover themselves before responding to us. Jason handed me a printout. Look at this. They changed the meeting agenda last minute. No mention of our request. They're pretending it doesn't exist. I scanned the document. Sure enough, the meeting was supposedly about community concerns and upcoming neighborhood improvements. Margaret wasn't going to acknowledge our request. She was going to try and control the narrative before we could force the issue. I smiled. Then we make sure they can't ignore us. As the meeting started, Margaret took her usual place at the front of the room, flanked by the rest of the HOA board. Alan was noticeably absent. Margaret cleared her throat and launched into her usual scripted pleasantries, thanking everyone for coming and outlining vague plans for the community. I let her talk. I let her think, just for a moment, that she had regained control. Then, when she paused to take a breath, I stood. Before we continue, I said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, we need to address the formal request submitted by the homeowners for a review of the HOA's financial records. Margaret's smile froze. This meeting has a set agenda, Nathan. I held up a stack of papers. And this is an official request, signed by the majority of homeowners in this community. You don't get to ignore it. A murmur spread through the crowd. Several homeowners nodded in agreement. Margaret's fingers tightened around her clipboard. There is a process for these things. I stepped forward. And we followed it. Now, you either provide the financial records as required by law, or you explain to everyone here why you're trying so hard to hide them. The room fell silent. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted completely. Margaret wasn't in control anymore, and she knew it. Margaret's grip on her clipboard tightened, her knuckles paling as she scanned the expectant faces of the homeowners. The silence in the room was oppressive, stretching far beyond what was comfortable. She was cornered, and she knew it. Her eyes darted to the other HOA board members, looking for support. Most of them avoided her gaze. Without Alan, she had lost her strongest enforcer. The others, likely realizing the storm that was about to hit, weren't eager to go down with her. She inhaled sharply, her voice clipped. This meeting was called to discuss community improvements. If you want to bring up other matters, there is a procedure that must be followed. I took a slow step forward, placing the stack of signed requests on the table in front of her. We followed the procedure. This request was submitted in writing, with the required number of homeowner signatures. You've had ample time to respond. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Linda crossed her arms. Why are you stalling? If everything's above board, just show us the financials. Jason nodded. Unless you have something to hide. Margaret's nostrils flared. The HOA board is responsible for managing funds in the best interest of the community. Not every homeowner needs to scrutinize every expense. I folded my arms. That's not how accountability works. You're legally required to disclose financial records upon request. If you refuse, you're violating state law. A flicker of unease crossed her features, but she recovered quickly. Records take time to compile. We will provide them when appropriate. I kept my eyes locked on hers. You had time to install metal spikes in my driveway, but not to print out a financial report? The room erupted in hushed conversations. Margaret's composure was cracking at the seams, and everyone saw it. A man toward the back of the room, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward. He was in his late 40s, with a sharp, analytical expression. "I'm an accountant," he said. "If you give me access to the records, I can review them for discrepancies." Margaret's jaw tightened. She didn't even try to mask her irritation. "That won't be necessary. The board is already handling the review internally." The accountant didn't back down. "That's not how oversight works. Internal reviews don't mean anything if the people conducting them are the same ones accused of mismanagement." Margaret's fingers drummed against her clipboard. She was losing control of the room. Jason leaned forward. "If you refuse to turn over the records, we can petition for a full legal audit. That won't be internal, and you won't have any say in the matter." Margaret's breath came in short, frustrated bursts. "This is ridiculous. You're all acting like there's some conspiracy here." Tessa stepped beside me. "Then prove there isn't." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. The accountant crossed his arms. "You have 24 hours to provide the records. If you don't, we move forward with legal action. And trust me, a forensic audit won't just look at this year's finances. It will go back years." The weight of that statement hung in the air. Margaret swallowed hard. One of the other board members, a wiry man in his 60s, finally spoke up. "Perhaps we should provide the records. Transparency is important." Margaret shot him a glare, but he avoided eye contact. Jason leaned against the wall. "Sounds like even your board thinks it's a good idea." Margaret's face was rigid, but she knew she was outnumbered. "Fine," she bit out. "You'll have the records tomorrow." The tension in the room shifted. People exchanged glances, some satisfied, others wary. I held her gaze for a moment longer, making sure she understood this wasn't over. "Good. We'll be expecting them." The meeting ended in a storm of hushed conversations. Homeowners gathered in small groups, discussing everything that had just unfolded. As Tessa and I stepped outside, Jason and Linda caught up with us. Linda exhaled. "She's going to try something. She won't just hand over clean records." I nodded. "I know. That's why we need to be ready." Jason rubbed the back of his neck. "If they try to doctor the numbers, how will we know?" The accountant, who had followed us outside, answered before I could. "I'll know. If they alter anything last minute, there will be inconsistencies. And if they try to delay further, that's another red flag." I shook his hand. "I appreciate your help. What's your name?" "David," he said. "And trust me, I've seen enough corporate fraud to know when someone's cooking the books." I glanced back toward the clubhouse. Margaret had just stepped outside, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. She was already making calls, planning whatever desperate move she had left. Tessa nudged me. "We need to make sure they don't destroy anything overnight." I nodded. "Yeah, we do." Linda's eyes narrowed. "What are you thinking?" I pulled out my phone and started dialing. "I'm thinking we make sure they don't get the chance." As the call connected, I stepped away from the group. Margaret thought she still had control. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. As the call connected, I stepped a few feet away from the others, keeping my voice low. The person on the other end picked up quickly. "I need a favor," I said. "We've got an HOA board that's about to start covering their tracks, and I don't want them destroying evidence before we get our hands on it." The voice on the other end responded with a short, knowing laugh. "Sounds like you've got them cornered." "More than that," I said. "They used HOA fees for unauthorized projects, and there's a good chance they've been mismanaging funds for years. I need someone watching their office tonight to make sure they don't start shredding documents." There was a pause. Then, "Consider it handled." I hung up and rejoined Tessa, Jason, Linda, and David. "Who was that?" Jason asked. "A contact at the city's fraud investigations unit," I said. "They'll make sure Margaret and her people don't try anything before tomorrow." David adjusted his glasses. "If they're smart, they'll comply. But I doubt they'll make it easy." Tessa crossed her arms. "Margaret's not the type to admit defeat. She'll try something." I glanced toward the clubhouse, where Margaret had disappeared inside. A few of the other board members were still lingering by the door, looking uneasy. "Let's see how much fight she has left," I said. "Because after tomorrow, it won't matter." The next morning, I arrived at the HOA office just before the scheduled meeting time. The building was small, a converted townhouse that doubled as their administrative center. Margaret's car was already parked out front, along with Alan's. Apparently, he had decided to show up after all. Tessa and I stepped inside, followed closely by Jason and Linda. A few other homeowners had come as well, their expressions tense. David was already seated at the long conference table, a laptop open in front of him. The board members were on the opposite side, looking uncomfortable. Margaret sat at the center, her usual air of smug authority gone. Alan, seated beside her, looked even worse. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped together on the table. I took a seat directly across from them. Let's see the records. Margaret exhaled slowly, then slid a thick binder across the table. Everything is here. David took it, flipping through the pages. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the numbers. After a few moments, he frowned. There are gaps here, he said. The last 2 years are missing detailed expense reports. These are just summaries. Margaret's expression remained neutral. That's all we have available at the moment. I leaned forward. That's not what the law requires. We need full, itemized records. If they're missing, that's considered financial mismanagement at best and fraud at worst. Alan shifted in his seat. We didn't think we needed to keep every single line item. David looked up from the binder. That's not how accounting works. And based on what I'm seeing, there are multiple unexplained withdrawals from the HOA fund. Thousands of dollars listed under miscellaneous expenses without any supporting documentation. Margaret's fingers curled against the table. Those were for community improvements. Tessa arched an eyebrow. Like the spikes. A ripple of quiet anger moved through the homeowners. David continued flipping through the pages. There are also multiple payments to a company that doesn't seem to exist. Grayson Neighborhood Services. He looked up. Alan, your last name is Grayson, isn't it? Alan paled. That's a coincidence. I pulled out my phone and started typing. Let's see about that. After a few moments, I found what I was looking for. There's no business registered under that name, which means those payments were either fraudulent or laundered through a shell company. Margaret's face turned rigid. This meeting is over. I didn't move. No, Margaret. It's just getting started. The door opened behind me, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. They weren't here for a courtesy visit. Alan's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. This is harassment. One of the officers held up a folder. We have a warrant to seize all financial records of this HOA for investigation. That includes digital files, emails, and any other documentation related to expenditures. Margaret's lips parted in shock. You can't do that. The officer didn't blink. We can, and we are. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The board members looked at one another, some of them clearly realizing just how deep they were in. Linda turned to the other homeowners who had gathered. This is exactly why we needed to fight back. They've been stealing from us for years. One of the officers gestured toward Alan. Mr. Grayson, we'll need you to come with us for questioning. Alan's face turned blotchy red. I didn't do anything wrong. David held up the binder. Then explain why thousands of dollars were funneled into a non-existent company with your last name. Alan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Margaret, but she was staring down at the table, saying nothing. The officer stepped forward. Let's go. Alan swallowed hard, then stood. He glanced at Margaret one last time, as if expecting her to save him. She didn't. As the officers led him out, the room remained silent. Jason exhaled sharply. Well, that was satisfying. Margaret slowly stood, her shoulders rigid. This board will be seeking legal counsel. I stood as well, keeping my voice calm. You should, because this is just the beginning. Once the audit is complete, we'll see just how deep this goes. And if we find more fraud, you won't just be losing your position. You'll be facing criminal charges. Margaret's jaw tightened. This is a witch hunt. Tessa tilted her head. Funny how people only say that when they're guilty. Margaret didn't respond. She gathered her things, then walked out without another word. As the door closed behind her, I turned back to the others. Linda shook her head. I still can't believe they were stealing from us this whole time. David closed the binder. Believe it. And from what I've seen, this could be just the tip of the iceberg. Jason leaned against the table. So what happens now? I glanced around at the homeowners who had gathered. We take control of the HOA. We elect new leadership, put safeguards in place, and make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Tessa smiled. And we celebrate the fact that Margaret doesn't get to control this neighborhood anymore. A ripple of agreement spread through the group. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't something to be feared. It was something that could finally work the way it was supposed to. And Margaret Holloway had just learned the hard way that no one, not even an HOA president, was above the law.